Thank you very much, David. And it's now my pleasure to introduce a former colleague, Anthea Gunn and Alexandra Torrens, to speak about war artists. Anthea was a former colleague of mine at the National Museum, and she's now, and has been for the past 10 years, Senior Curator of Art at the Memorial, as is her colleague Alexandra Torrens, both Senior Curators of Art, and they will both talk about war artists. Over to you, Alex.
Bring this right down. Everybody hear me well enough?
Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for having us. Due to our unusual status as co-presenting, I can share the podium, so let's get cracking. The art collection of Australian War Memorial both reflects and helps to shape the Australians' understanding of the war, and examining our holdings has been an interesting exercise. We discovered that approximately 100 works in the collection were variously catalogued as being created in connection with India, Sri Lanka, or the Eastern Fleet. So for audiences and curators unfamiliar with the nature of the campaign and where Australians were stationed, it was not potentially easy to identify these works as being created in response to Australia's service in Burma. Researching and writing this chapter has given us the opportunity to visit many of the works and improve the documentation, including the photography, which we hope will contribute to improving the public's understanding of the important, interesting roles Australians played in Burma during this war. Of the 45 official war artists deployed around the world by Australia during the Second World War, only 3 went to Burma. So Frank Norton, Roy Hodgkinson, and William Darby. All 3 were experienced war artists at the time of their deployments. Here they are. Today we're going to discuss each of them briefly to get a sense of what they witnessed. Interestingly too, these photographs to me kind of also all tell you something a little bit about their personalities. Also, as we were able to get quite a lot of the artworks digitised for the first time in a while, we brought a lot of them along to show people. So we probably do have too many slides, just warning you.
Well, I don't have too many minutes.
No. Appointed to the RAN in 1941, Frank Norton worked almost continuously for the entire war, mostly overseas, living rough, alongside crews of various HMA ships, and at times working to the point of exhaustion. In the field, he was hard-working and diligent in his record-keeping, which was amazing as a curator going back in to assess his work, and concerned really with depicting with exacting technical accuracy the environments of RAN ships, and gathering data to produce larger paintings of naval actions for the galleries. In 1942, he had successfully completed his first large painting commission, which was of the action that resulted in the sinking of HMS Sydney. And his new posting to the Eastern Fleet saw him buoyed by this success and ambitious to continue working on significant subject matter. Unfortunately, the relatively routine nature of the RAN activities of the fleet meant that the action that he saw was limited. However, despite his frustrations and the relatively dull time he was having, Norton was prolific as ever. By 1943, he had developed a way of working that was to continue right through to the end of his career in war service. There are over 600 works by Norton in the collection, and sometimes as a land-loving curator, they can become a little bit repetitive in their choice of subject matter and aspect. But in a way, this indicates just how comprehensive his approach was to every single posting. So I promised some images. One of the joys of this research was discovering that the Memorial had purchased in 2015 Norton's sketchbook from late December, January 1944. And the sketchbooks didn't automatically come into the collections with the artist during the Second World War, and so for these, as curators, are a wonderful way to see just how the artist worked. You can see here just how good he was and how much time he spent even doing the detail of a refueling. He also worked with his favourite mediums of watercolour and carbon pencil and life, always on this kind of grey-blue background for effect. Another role he had was his commercial training and design hat on, so constantly he was always looking for scenes, I think, and aspects that would translate well in publication. Following about 3 months with the corvettes and destroyers, the last 3 months of his time was really spent working out of a wardroom studio at Colombo. He was quite unwell and spent 2 weeks in hospital with an infected toenail, And his lack of communication was really affecting his mood. Mail was lagging by about 3 months by then, and I think it put him in a position where he couldn't really make a decision about moving on to the RAF. I think he was reluctant to do that anyway, but also reluctant to join another naval ship. However, fortuitously, his works and his letters started getting through to Trelaw in Canberra, and he was brought back to Australia and redeployed to the Southwest Pacific area. It was hoped that he'd find more stirring material. One of the jewels, I think, of the works that he did at that time in Ceylon are these wonderful little paintings. He was a very good exponent of alla prima kind of painting style, which was a very quick wet-on-wet technique. Some of the works he did directly from life, and others he worked up in that time in the studio period. I just wanted to end with his painting of a convoy. Despite a lot of the wailing that he did in his writing about lacking action and the frustrations, he did say of painting this work that even though convoying was seen by many to be quite a monotonous labour, he felt that he really wanted to be true to the men and honour their work by painting these subjects. And you can see, even though these paintings clearly come from someone who has much love for the ships and the work that the men were doing, and that's why I think his work was so popular with veterans. Roy Hodgson's work as an official was depended on his ability to draw as well, and he gained skills and reputation as a newspaper illustrator and approached his commission pretty much as a war correspondent, creating images that were simultaneously informative and entertaining. Having military experience and an extroverted personality, he saw him fitting in well with troops wherever he went. His ability to work contacts and his efficiency in the field resulted in him being the only one of the 3 official war artists that came anywhere close to getting through Torrens' planned rotations from the RAF to the RAN and back again in Burma. It's clear in his letters and interviews in later life that Roy really saw his contribution was to create work that would appeal to veterans as true representations of their experience for the memorial and to function as morale-boosting propaganda for the AWM service animals. Arriving in October 1944, he worked for just 3 short weeks with the RAN and also missed any naval action, mainly because he'd stayed around in Colombo at that time. Served by Trelaw as a jobber for the annuals, his focus was on people, not ships. And unlike Norton, he spent considerable time recording shore leave, and his famous Jack Ashore series depicted sailors in various exotic locales, including Penang markets. In March, he moved to the RAF and to 205 Squadron at Copper Lakes, then to the Transport Air Wing via Calcutta, where he spent the rest of his time and not returning to practically the end of the war in July 1945. He saw the need to focus on the important work the Transport Squadron was doing, perhaps with his journalistic kind of eye for the story, and after reviewing Dargie's working list, which made it very clear that Dargie had spent a lot of time with the fighters already. With the RAF, back with the RAF, he wrote to Trelaw that he was feeling back in his New Guinea days, living under canvas, dealing with the climate and the weather, much the same way as he had in the jungle with the men. He felt very comfortable, and he also began recording in a kind of systematic way that he honed over there the units that he was attached to. You can see he did this in a couple of ways, basically by making vignettes of interesting camp life, portraits. All of Hodgson's drawing were driven by narrative, so he was very concerned with pictorially telling a story. He continued working on his composite images, and you can see here he went to a lot of trouble to go on operational flights, to be on the airfield, because as with Norton, it was very important for him to be an eyewitness to these events in a way that they would imbue his works with a kind of authenticity. And finally, another joy to be found working on this chapter was a series of watercolours that he did of each of the bases that he was attached to with transport squadrons. And so he created sort of scenes and then accompanied them with these works he called sort of atmospheric works. And you can see the one on the right with the Sunderland's under repair. It's kind of a way that he had to meld architecture and climate, just to kind of evoke the working environments of each of the squadrons. So here's one with 194. He was there on extreme dusty conditions. And I talk about the one on the right quite a bit in the chapter. And here again with 117 Squadron further down near Ramree Island. He rounded out his commission, spending time working with the Dum Dum Squadron, flying at high altitude, and actually won the award as being the artist at the time to have flown at the highest altitude. And I included this one on the right in this way because it was sort of this atmospheric drawing going over the Himalayas. But when I found it in the collection, it was still wrapped up in this little map that he sent it back to me. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to my colleague before the time is up.
So I'll continue straight along with Berg and Dargy. Dargy at the time, or sort of during the war, became one of the best known Australian artists to have been deployed as an official war artist during the Second World War. He served from 1941, finding out while he was apparently digging a trench into Brook that he won the Archibald Prize for the first time, with his painting we see on the left. He would go on to win that, I think, 8 times. I think there's still standing record for the most numbers of wins by a single painter. After the war, he became perhaps best known for the famous wattle portrait of the Queen, where she's wearing the wattle dress from her 1950s visit. So he really became kind of one of the sort of celebrity established, really sort of household names of Australian art during this era. He served consistently from 1941, so going on to spend quite a bit of time in New Guinea, which is perhaps where I think most of his best known works from his deployment as an official war artist either were created in the field or this large painting subsequently in the studio, which has pretty much been on continual display at the memorial. But that meant by the time he was sent to Burma in late 1944, he'd been at work in really trying conditions for that whole 4-year period, which meant that his health was really starting to suffer. He kind of described it as not feeling, his work wasn't fresh, which I think was a very sort of Dargy term to cover a real multitude of hardship. I think he probably endured most of the kind of non-combat challenges that we've heard about today, one of which was just communication. So Treloar, by this point, had developed really efficient kind of communication with the military, but in the field there are so many demands on everyone's time and capacity that the word always didn't get through. So the point of Dargy's visit was timed so that he could spend some time in Burma ahead of heading to Greece by March of 1945, so that he could be there at the same time of year as the Australians had previously fought in Greece, so that he could kind of retrospectively create the paintings. Because of course one of the challenges the art committee had was trying to get artists to where the fighting would happen, because they didn't actually have a crystal ball to say where that would happen. Dargy originally was supposed to take over from the artist in Singapore, who unfortunately Murray Griffin ends up in Changi because Singapore fell. They had this plan where Murray Griffin would have gone on to the Middle East, but of course the war didn't quite, for some reason, didn't fall in line with the art committee's plans for the Australian artists, which was unfortunate. So Dargy arrives, word hasn't been received that he's coming, so he ends up spending the first 2 weeks of his 3-month deployment in a transit camp, waiting for the onward train to take him to where he needed to be. He finally arrives kind of mid-December and spends sort of fortnightly attachments with the different squadrons. Dargy really struggled because his time in New Guinea had primarily been spent with the army. He really loved being amongst the troops, doing his bit. You could really see all those kind of attributes of the way people talked about their service, wanting to do their bit, not shirking, being courageous. All of those values were ones that Dargy demonstrates. And so he really struggled with the RAF, because how do you show what fighter pilots are doing, because you can't really just stick an artist in the back. This is the first painting he did, and he must have based it on oral accounts of the fighting and bombing of a railway station, and it's not entirely successful. And so he then adjusts his approach to a much more successful strategy of recording the individuals, the context in which they were working, the air bases. This is a little sketch by him that I just love, showing the effects of the monsoon. The planes have been grounded because of the conditions, and just those little daubs of white paint. You can see how he's creating that sense of just absolutely sodden ground that a plane can't take off from. This rather miserable figure coming towards us, but when you look closely, that's just a few smears of paint, but I think it really conveys a sense of that man's experiences. The Australians really do contrast with the other artists that are associated with Burma, the handful of which we've been able to identify. Anthony Gross was the British artist. that was in Burma for both longer and earlier and on the ground with the army, so a totally different experience. And also the reasons why he was deployed included all of the ambitions of the British trying to pull together the different parts of the empire and really trying to, as we've heard about, try to engage with all the local communities and all the different objectives that people had. And so Gross was on the ground with the different tribes, recording kind of what they were doing, their dress, all these things. All that body of work toured Australia. And so that was also one of the sources that Australians were learning about Burma during the war. We heard this morning about the extent of press coverage. This is kind of one component of that larger propaganda exercise. And then another Australian artist who created completely different work and only a tiny body of work, unfortunately, was Peter Perth Smith, who was an Australian artist, was in London at the outbreak of the war, joined the British Army and served with the Chindits. But as a result, his health basically broke down, so he dies in the late 1940s. And in between the end of the war and his death, he creates a small body of basically surrealist paintings that I think capture the impact of his service, because this body of work really are this sense of someone grappling with modern society. Mary Eagle, the art historian, wrote about his work beautifully and his service in quite some detail. And so those two works I've just shown you are, I guess, the sort of alternate views of the war, whereas the Australian records are, there's a particular point of view and a focus and purpose they have in creating their work, but they're only one of the many options that could have happened. But what they did do was create this very detailed historic record of what Australians did, which for us, this chapter has been a real opportunity for us to reconnect with that. I must confess, when Andrew first called me about this, I'm like, were there Australian artists in Burma? And so this has just been such a wonderful opportunity for us, I think, to really delve into that part of the collection. And as Alex was saying, catalogue it, get it online, get people connected to it, because it is records like this that help develop the public memory of parts of the war. And it's things like the way that, Ivor Hill and Ludadi's other paintings have kind of helped contribute to the sort of public's imagination of what things like Channy and Kokoda and Tobruk all became the kind of, the memories of Australia generally associated with the Second World War. Art's, of course, only one part of a very complex picture, but it has been a real wonderful opportunity to try and unearth some of these records, and I think for us both a really wonderful opportunity. So really thank you for that. I'll conclude on that note.
Thanks, Alex and Anthea, leading the charge for an art-led revival in memory of the Second World War. You heard it here first.